Good morning, everyone, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with journalists and authors about their important work and the stories behind them. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. Today, I'm so pleased to welcome Simon Rosenberg to First Draft. You know him as the author of Hopium Chronicles right here on Substack. He's a political strategist who's worked for the DNC, the DCCC, several political campaigns, including presidential campaigns. And in 2022, he was one of the lone voices in the wilderness telling us that a red wave was not coming. Simon, thank you so much for being here today.
Susan, it's great. I just have one addition to your bio in the beginning, which is you're the kick-ass executive editor, I think, of Lincoln Square. Anyway, you're doing a great job, and it's fun to be with you here today.
Oh, thank you. Well, usually we've got you with Stuart Stevens or Rick Wilson, so I'm glad that I get to monopolize your time for at least a half hour. Yeah. But I want to start with this polling snafu that we've seen because I think a lot of people really got to know your work in 2022 when you were one of the few people who was saying all of these polls that Republicans are putting out are shit. Let's just be honest. They're flooding the zone with shit. They're trying to sell you a narrative and they're succeeding, but this red wave is not coming. Now, this year, I don't think it's quite as bad, but we have seen some really bad misses, both in Michigan and in Wisconsin with polling. And we actually had a firm come out and say, yeah, we were putting out complete crap because we wanted to see if people would pick it up, and spoiler alert, you did. So what can we believe in terms of polling going into this extremely crucial election in 69 days?
So there's a couple different things happening at the same time that's weakening the integrity of the data and the polling process of how we assess where things are in our politics. One of them, and I did a big talk with Tom Bonnier on this a few days ago, who's been my kind of partner in this work over the last few years. First is that because of new polling technology, this barrier to entry for just everyday people to get involved and do polling cheaply and has allowed many new entrants into the polling ecosystem. And these are lower quality. Oftentimes, this cheap technology is of lower quality. It's not the sort of gold standard. As Tom mentioned, a gold standard poll like we see from the New York Times, these things cost $40,000, $50,000 a state or a poll. You can do these kind of cheap and dirty polls for a few $1,000s. And so what it's done is, number one, is that it's introduced a lot more low quality polling into the polling ecosystem. But the second thing, and so the data we're seeing and the pollsters who are interpreting the elections are less reliable than they used to be. The second thing that's happening, though, and this really began in 2022, as you mentioned, is there's clear manipulation of polling to create narratives that are favorable to, mostly Republicans. The red wave was a manufactured effort. They ran almost 50 polls in a handful of key Senate states, 12 different pollsters, creating a false impression that there was a red wave coming, which never came. And, Trump used similar tactics in 2024 to game the polling averages. We saw it in New Jersey in November last year. There was a massive effort by right-wing pollsters to create an impression that race was close when Mikey Sherrill won by 14 points. We saw it again in Hungary in 2026, where the government-aligned pollsters showed, Orban winning, and all the other independent polls showed him losing. And we're going to see it this fall. And there's no question in my mind that Republicans will attempt this again. And my guess is, here's my assessment of what we should expect, is that in 4 to 6 Senate races, which are very close within margin of error, they will start producing a steady stream of polls showing their candidate ahead, trying to convince Democrats that the Senate is lost. And there's no reason for us to, do the work we need to flip the Senate. They're going to do it because they did it 4 years ago and it worked. And so they're going to do it again. And I would argue they did it in 2024 with Trump and it worked then. And so we should anticipate that, right? And the second thing is we're beginning to see what may be an op in the Georgia governor's race. It's still a little bit early to make that conclusion, but we've now seen the two independent polls in Georgia. Governor has our candidate Keisha Lance Bottoms up by 5 and 7 points. There have been 4 Republican polls that have shown the race basically dead even. This is exactly the kind of things they did in 2022. It's exactly what they did in New Jersey in 2025, where they created a flood of polls that created a different polling universe, right? When you look at these Republican polls, the race in Georgia is dead even. Mm-hmm. Look at the independent polls, and she's up by 5, 6, 7 points outside a margin of error. That's literally exactly what happened in the New Jersey governor's race in 2025. So we've been in touch with the Georgia Democratic Party. Yesterday, we had a call with them to walk them through what we were seeing. And we just, my point that I just want to make to everybody is that Donald Trump already conspired openly with a hostile foreign power to influence the elections in 2026. He tried to overturn an election in 2021 and an insurrection, attack the Capitol. Playing around, spending a few $1 million trying to play around with the polling averages to create a more favorable understanding of the environment is like miniature golf compared to this, the US Open, right, that they've already done. So this is kind of minor stuff. And one of the things I've concluded, Susan, and I'll wrap up, is that watching what happened with Orban and how naked and ridiculous it was, and you even had a Trump MAGA pollster, John McLaughlin, polling over there in Hungarian, which I'd love to know how that all worked. His last poll was off by 34 points taken in the last week. I mean, these are not real polls, right? They're making these up in order to create a false impression for their supporters and for the national media. And what I began to realize is that maybe the Republicans learned these tactics from Orban. And because this is new, I mean, these kinds of flood of polls, of partisan Republican polls into the ecosystem. It was 50 polls in 2022. It was probably 150 polls in 2024. This is a new thing and a new tactic, but we shouldn't be surprised because Donald Trump doesn't he doesn't follow rule of law. He doesn't play by normal rules. He flouts. That's his whole personality. So this is part of us anticipating that they're going to do whatever it takes to win the election and prevent us from taking power in January of next year. This is just one piece of a broader effort on their part.
Well, and I think it fits in with what MAGA and Donald Trump do all the time, which is they try and create their own reality, especially online. And so these fake polls or these skewed polls kind of fit in with that narrative because, in their mind, Donald Trump is a king and everything is always sunny under Donald Trump. And so why not have polls that fit that narrative to keep people motivated? But what I thought was really interesting and a point that you made was with the polls that we saw in the Democratic primaries in Wisconsin and in Michigan, this was on the Democratic side, and there were a lot of polls that were put out by the progressive candidates in the race and organizations that were, sympathetic to them. Was that also, kind of taking a page from what Republicans are doing and creating this reality that matched up what we were seeing in the online bubble? But when you got to the general electorate, that narrative fell apart a little bit. We did have Abdul Al-Sayed, who did narrowly win in the Michigan Democratic primary for Senate, but Francesca Hong, who surveys were showing she was 30 points ahead, she lost on election day in the Wisconsin gubernatorial race. So talk with us about that.
Yeah, I mean, so the two other pieces that I didn't cover in my long rant there in the beginning were, number one, the thing you mentioned about in the introduction about that in the last few weeks, we had this remarkable thing happen where a 21-year-old guy using AI created a fake polling organization called Median Strategies and released polls in 3 states that got wide coverage as legitimate polls, even though the organization didn't exist and the polls were fake. And he did it, he claims, as a social experiment after watching what happened in Michigan and in Michigan, about whether or not it really was possible for somebody to fake polls and have those polls influence the coverage of the race. And he showed that it was possible. And, he spent probably, $1,000, $2,000, and his polls got covered in California and in Wisconsin. And there was a third state, I'm forgetting now, where he released it. And it gets back to this idea that there's a lower barrier to entry, that people are now just, new entrants, new Wedgwood polls, all these new pollsters who are not people that are established pollsters who work either for media organizations or for campaigns or the party committees. It's this new kind of thing that's emerged. And it's worrisome because it's creating another condition for manipulation, right? And one of the things we may not get into, the other piece of this is what's happening with the prediction markets, which, if we have time, which is creating a whole new layer of sort of ridiculous information that it's influencing people's understanding of the elections. But what happened, there's no question, and I haven't had the time, to be honest with you, to look at this as much as I should. But there is evidence that on our side, there are forces that are beginning to emulate these kind of tactics that have been used by Orban and by MAGA here in the U.S. In the Michigan race, of the last 18 polls done, 8 of them came from allies of Abdul El Sayed. So almost half of the polls, they all showed data him with way ahead. I mean, the last 4 polls they released in the primary, I think the average, he was up by 16 points. The last poll released by Zenith, this guy Adam Carlson, he was up by 19 points. I mean,
he ended up winning the race by 14,000 votes.
By 14,000 votes. And so these polls, they've tried to sort of argue there was methodological problems and they didn't anticipate the electorate properly. But, the truth is, anybody who's off by 18, 19 points should never be considered a serious pollster ever again. Margin of error is 3-4 points, right? The science of polling, if you can call it a science, is that there's built-in, errors that happen, but those are 3 or 4 points. It's not 18, 19 points. And so it raises questions about the integrity and competence of the pollsters, or whether or not this was an op, right, to sort of shape and frame the understanding. Because there were independent polls showing the race either, there was an independent poll. The last independent poll taken in Michigan had Haley Stevens ahead
by 7 points.
By 7 points, right? So there was independent polling, and the thing is, when I reported on that on social media, of course, I was viciously attacked by El Sayed supporters for even putting up. All I wrote was like, "Here's a poll," right? And by a prominent, respected independent pollster that showed different data. So we have to have. I think that in general, where we're going with this, Susan, is that, and I think the New York Times piece that you pulled up in the beginning was by Reed Epstein, was an important kind of early effort to grapple with the uncertainty of the data now that exists, and how, I think this is long overdue. There should have been a much bigger reckoning after what happened in 2022. But the truth is, there were 2 ways there was a reckoning after 2022. Number one is the New York Times did an investigative piece by people outside of their political team to understand how they got the election wrong. Because the New York Times was instrumental in creating the impression of the red wave. They had a piece by Shane Goldmacher on October 23rd in 2022 where it had the red wave in the title. And when that happened, and when the Times said red wave, everybody followed after that. The Times then did this remarkable, which you should link to when you release this, remarkable investigative piece that took 6 weeks, where they tried to figure out what happened. And it's a tremendous independent look at the way Republicans manipulated the polling in 2022. But then the other thing that happened is that Nate Silver, and ABC and 538 parted ways, in part because Nate, had laundered some of this garbage polling into his polling averages, knowing, and I and others were calling him out on it. And it led to a reckoning with 538 and Nate after the election because of the promotion of this basically fake data that misled the American people. And so, but there hasn't been a broader reckoning in our discourse about the obvious daily manipulation of polls by the Republican Party. because I think that a lot of people who make a living on this don't want to sort of point out that the system is being gamed or that there's lack of integrity to this. And one of the things that Tom Bonnier and I are going to be more adamant about as one way of dealing with this is that we think that every poll that gets covered needs to have some kind of certification that the poll actually took place, that they paid money, that there was a process, that there was a firm that did the actual work, made the calls or did the panels, the internet panels, however they did the poll, as a way of making sure the poll actually happened. Because we believed in 2022, a lot of the polls in this red wave effort never happened. They weren't actual polls. Because it's a lot easier to make up numbers. It's a lot cheaper. I mean, if a normal poll costs $40,000, and you're going to put out 50 polls, it's a lot easier just to make up the data than it is to actually pay for all that polling. And so one of the sort of reforms that I think are going to be needed for us to restore greater integrity and trust is to to mandate that the poll has a certification, some kind of independent certification that it's an actual real poll and that they followed the methodology that they claim. Because we've had we've seen some of the biggest polling errors, right, of modern times in recent months. And it's something that, does impact, this stuff has an enormous impact on our understanding and of our politics. Michigan being a very good example of a state where everyone called Abdul Said the front runner for the last 3 or 4 weeks, which he wasn't. And was that, and same thing with Francesca Hung, right? That she was, and those kinds of assertions of strength and power and success, which is what Trump wants, right? Trump always wants to be winning in the polls because it means that he's strong and he's a winner. And a lot of this comes down to this, right? Is that in the 2024, we know from the exit polls, the election broke heavily towards Trump in the final week. Well, in 10 days before the election, because of this flood of Republican polls, the polling averages tipped to be for Trump. And so if you're a lower information voter and you're not really paying that much attention and you're not really that interested in politics, what you saw on social media was that Trump was winning and he was strong and Harris was losing and she was weak. And of course, people want to go with the winner, right? Like it's just a natural human thing. And so we know from Trump's own post, I don't know if you have that in your battery of stuff, Trump yesterday, 2 days ago, made a very consequential, this is a big deal. And if I can explain this to everybody for a minute, here's Donald Trump himself explaining what he believes happens when somebody fakes polls, which is what they've been doing, right? What he says is that they are called demoralization operations. In our language as Democrats, we call that demobilization. So Donald Trump is telling you that they believe that the fake polls that they put out in 2022 and 2024 and in 2025, now in 2026, was designed to demobilize us, to suppress our vote, to create an understanding that we were losing and they were winning and therefore people wouldn't participate. And he's telling us in his own words, that's how they understand this dynamic. So why wouldn't he use this same tactic that they've used in 2022 and 2024 and 2025 again in the fall elections? And we just have to be smart and anticipate it. And one of the things, Susan, you're giving me a lot of airtime in this, when this started in New Jersey, and I had never talked about this before until this week, I and the DNC I worked with the DNC to have an intervention with the Sherrill campaign about this. And we walked them through what they had done in the last 2 elections, how this was going to play out. And the Sherrill campaign developed for the first time, because I tried to get the Harris campaign to deal with this stuff in 24 and they just didn't do it. And the National Party didn't do anything about the fake polling in 2022. The DNC and the DGA and the Sherrill campaign and I developed a strategy to counter this. And what they did is they started promoting the independent polls, showing her ahead by 5, 6, 7 points. And instead of claiming that she was the underdog and she was weak, they said she was winning and she was strong. And in part because that was also the branding for her, having been in the Navy and a helicopter pilot, right? And so they took the independent polls and put them into their ads and showed people that she was winning the election and she was strong and her opponent was losing the election and was weak, as a way of countering this massive effort. They released at least a dozen polls in the last few weeks of the election in New Jersey to gauge, and Sherrill won by 14 points. The average of those Republican polls in the final few weeks was 1 point. So we saw in the Sherrill campaign the first time that we had created a strategic response to this kind of illicit activity. And we're now, yesterday, I did a call with the Georgia party to begin the effort for them to look at whether or not this is now happening in the Georgia governor's race, which I think it is, and in order to develop a strategic response. I'll be working, with a group. I'm now working with the state parties, and we've created something we call the New Battlefield Project to help us close strong. And we've got a communications hub there, sort of a war room, where we're going to be working with the state parties across the country to help them anticipate this kind of illicit activity, of all kinds, hybrid war tactics. Our party was attacked in 2016, to anticipate them and to create strategic responses when they come. So we began that effort. We just launched this effort last week. We're going to be doing election protection work. We're going to be doing a national campaign to promote people to vote early, to help counter this kind of mail ballot crap that Trump is doing. And we've also set up this kind of war room to help the state parties understand the illicit activities that are going to come and counter them effectively in the election. And what we did with Georgia yesterday was an example of the kind of work we'll be doing through Election Day.
Simon, in 2022, when I was the editor of the Michigan Advance and covering elections there, I actually did a post-mortem on the governor's race because we're seeing crap polls there too. One of the most recent polls before Election Day showed the Republican Tudor Dixon was within 1 point of Gretchen Whitmer, who went on to win by 11 points. I mean, it was a huge miss, but it helped drive the narrative. And I went through because you really could see how this was driving the coverage. And we kept getting all of these stories about how Tudor Dixon was on the verge of a breakthrough. It was going to be a huge upset. And she was even being mentioned, for like a future Trump cabinet post. Or,
by the way, this happened in all the battleground states in 2022.
Right.
And what they do, Susan, what's very important about what you're saying, right, is what they want to do is create an impression of momentum at the end.
Yes.
That their candidate is surging and strong and powerful and winning. Our candidate is losing ground and is weak and is, because so much of MAGA's politics is seen through this prism of strong and weak, winning and losing, right? It's the central way that Trump sees the world.
Yes.
And so what you're describing happened in Georgia. It happened all over the country and what's happening in Georgia now, let me just bring it up to present day. So we had these two polls showing up, Keisha Lance Bottoms by 5 and 7 points. They've now had 4 polls showing the race basically even. And so what happens is in the right-wing ecosystem that then bleeds into the mainstream and legacy media discourse is that she's losing ground, he's gaining ground, she's weak, he's strong. Mm-hmm. And it's all artificial, right? And the thing that's incredible about this, about what they do on this stuff is that what was my point about that? Is about that let's just take, for example, national polling right now across the country. Mm-hmm. There is no race in America that in the battleground where a Republican is gaining ground anywhere. It's not in the national polling. It's not in the generic ballot. It's not in any of the Senate or gubernatorial races. But somehow in Georgia, in this one race, their candidate is surging in the polling in Georgia. And of course, he isn't. But they can't tolerate the notion that a strong black woman could beat a MAGA man in Georgia. And so they're heavily motivated to discredit her because of all the races in the country. And I explained this to the party yesterday. I'm not surprised this is the race that they have focused on early because the idea in this state where Trump has been so obsessed with the election outcomes in Georgia, to have a black woman beat a MAGA man, right, would be humiliating for them in a way that other losses wouldn't be. And so my anticipation is they're going to do whatever they can to win this race where we have a very strong candidate and a very strong Democratic Party. They have a weak and beleaguered party and a terrible candidate running for governor. And so it's interesting that this is where they've sort of launched their opening salvo, but it's not surprising. Anyway, I'm sorry if I cut you off, but you're exactly right. I mean, the tactic you're describing, and I now remember that Whitmer was probably one of the most extreme examples in the whole country. Why? Also, she was a woman, right?
Right, absolutely. And a lot of the narrative completely ignored Roe versus Wade being overturned and the extreme anger that female voters were experiencing, which I thought was also an important part of the story. We talked a little bit about some of these questionable polls from lesser known outfits, but I wanted to talk with you because a dynamic we saw in 2024, one of the last polls that came out in Iowa from Jan Selzer, who was considered the gold standard of polling in Iowa, showed that Donald Trump was behind. As it turned out, that poll was not accurate because not all polls are, but the extreme reaction from Donald Trump to sue her, and the paper did not, the Des Moines Register didn't end up having her back. She ended up retiring. I'm wondering about these perverse incentives for very good pollsters who, look, sometimes they miss the mark. That happens with anybody. But what's the incentive if you're getting threats when you show a poll that shows that Abdul al-Sayed is not up in Michigan? And you're sued by the future president of the United States. What's the incentive for good pollsters to stay in the game?
It's a great question. And by the way, I have a little bit more time. So if you want to just conclude by just talking about just the state of the election itself too, I'd love to weigh in on that before we go. But it's a great question, Susan. And I appreciate the thoughtfulness of this. I think that, I saw in the aftermath of that story last week about the 21-year-old kid faking polls, I saw a quote from a prominent Democratic strategist who said, my expectation is that every one of the presidential campaigns will be, basically manipulating the polling environment as sort of now a common everyday tactic, releasing their own polls, having allies release polls, helping shape the environment. I think we need to have a big conversation in our family about this and about whether or not whether we should accept that as a reality, or whether we should demand some kind of higher commitment to the integrity of data, because we're the pro-truth party, right? We're not the pro-gaslighting, pro-bullshit party, post-truth party, right? We believe the sky is blue and we believe that facts matter. And I think that there needs to be a big conversation about this. And I think that, I guess what I left out of my narrative about in the early part, there are really three reasons that the polling has gotten more wobbly. One is the lower barrier to entry. Second is the manipulation. But the third is the decline of legacy media, where, they don't have as much money as they used to, and there's far less independent polling than there used to be. And so, we're facing a little bit of a sort of structural crisis in this space. And even at Hopium, right, where, I write every day about data, this is part of my thing, right? I don't use polling averages because I don't trust them anymore, because there's so much partisan and low quality data. And even though the polling average is like 50-51, and, which is a terrific site and a great addition to our family, the broader family of data nerds, is that, they have ways of weighting the low quality polls and all this, but there's a little bit of kind of like, magic in that, right? And I think so. What I do is I show people the individual polls. That I think have high integrity. I don't try to claim that the polling averages speak for what's happening in the election, because I don't think we can trust so much of the data now that's in the system, and it's hard for the American people. I mean, in this time of just unrelenting, it's why Lincoln Square exists. It's why Hopium exists, is that I set up Hopium literally, as a counter to the kind of just incredible, as somebody who grew up in the media business, I worked for ABC News as a young guy, to have seen the entire legacy media fall for this false story around the red wave was really I was really unnerved by it. And it made me realize that I needed to not encourage people to create independent media. I had to create it myself. And that's why, I went out and founded Hopium. But I think that there needs to be what's important about this latest New York Times piece that Reed Epstein did. It was the first time really in legacy media that there was a sort of like, Houston, we got a big problem here, and we got to deal with this. And like, we've been, we in the legacy media have been participating in this and encouraging, bad data and bad information, and we've been spreading it. It's part of the reason Nate Silver was, and 538 parted ways in ABC, because there was a perception that Nate had encouraged, bad information, and I think that, but there hasn't been a broader reckoning, and I think that needs to happen now. Because we're going to enter a presidential cycle where, there's going to be tremendous competition on both sides. The House and Senate will be competitive again, right? And we're going to go through all this again. And we just can't, we have to wake up and come up, and we're going to be, all of us together. I mean, you've got some of the most experienced political operatives in America, with Lincoln Square. We all need to be leading this conversation about finding a better path here than we're on now. And I think that, I'm going to be doing my part, but we should be working together on this, Susan.
I appreciate that. And if you don't subscribe to Hopium Chronicles, I hope that you do. And we'd love to have you here at Lincoln Square as well. Just have to say that. But let's get into the environment that we're in right now, 69 days out before the election. I think the general consensus is that there is a blue wave that's building. I think what everyone wants to know is how big of a wave it is, especially with the structural barriers that we have thanks to gerrymandering and the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Look, I've been looking at data. I've been involved in every election since 1992, and I've been on waves on both sides. And it was one of the reasons that I knew that 2022 wasn't a wave, because it just, as Tom mentioned, I mean, we not only were seeing independent polling showing the race close and competitive, but we were seeing voter registration breaking our way and the early vote breaking our way. And we had, these other measures of intensity that were not indicating a wave in 2022. In 26, all the measures are indicating, a very strong election for the Democrats. However, whatever data you look at, our strong performances in the special elections, the huge, amazing performances in November of 2025, our primary performances in elections all over the country this year, where Democrats have been outvoting Republicans in virtually every state by huge margins, showing incredible intensity. We've seen it in some of the voter reg data, where Democrats are regaining after years of Republicans just crushing us in voter registration. We've seen Democrats starting to make significant and meaningful gains in some places, which is consistent with sort of the vibe. We've seen it. The national polling is all very, consistent with this being, Trump's approval rating being historically terrible and not recovering. By the way, no matter what they do, they can't get it up over there in the White House. And then the state polling, which is also all remarkably consistent with the national polling, right? I mean, when you look at all the data, it's all telling the same story, which is that, the House should flip. Even just today, we had an incredible set of polling in Texas where 3 of those 5 districts that the Republicans gerrymandered to steal those seats away from us, our candidates are winning in 3 of the 5, which is, that alone could, is, you add that plus Pennsylvania, the House flips, right? I mean, like, it's such a low margin. And Pennsylvania, I guess let me do this, right? So we had 2 sets of polls this week that are actually really important for 2026, which is the set of Texas polls that are showing also that the Hispanic vote is now breaking significantly towards us in Texas, which is also, if it holds, means that Texas becomes a purple state and not a red state any longer. And so there's deep significance about what's happening. This polling is very important today. But the other one was the Pennsylvania poll that came out yesterday, showing Josh in the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Josh Shapiro is up by 17 points. The generic ballot, we're up by 7, which means that we could pick up as many as 4 House seats in Pennsylvania. So just between what's happening in Texas and Pennsylvania, the House flips in all likelihood, right? Just those 2 states alone, where current polling is. And then in the Senate, we've had polling in recent months showing us ahead in Alaska, ahead in Texas. Tallarico's ahead in every single poll taken since Paxton became the nominee. Sherrod Brown has been up by 8 points in the last 2 Ohio polls.
Yeah.
In Iowa, Josh Turek has been up in some polls. Today, there's a new poll showing him down, but it's within margin of error. It's a close competitive race. Rob Sand, our gubernatorial candidate there, is ahead in every poll. I know you guys have been doing a lot of work about Iowa. It's a fascinating state this cycle. It's a place we've invested enormous amounts of money this cycle. And then, Cooper and Ossoff are up by high single digits, even double digits in some polls. Troy Jackson has been up in every poll taken since he became the candidate. Still a very close race, but he's also raising money, putting his team together. Hannah Pingree, our gubernatorial candidate there, is doing remarkably well. So the climate is very strong for us in Maine. The generic ballot there was 11 points, I think, in the New York Times poll, suggesting that, Troy Jackson can win this thing, even with the late start that he's gotten. And then in Michigan, in Minnesota, where we've had these contested primaries, Peggy Flanagan is ahead in all the public polling since their contentious primary fight. And Abdul El-Sayed is ahead in most of the polls, not all of them, but most of the polls in Michigan. And so there's no major competitive battleground House or Senate or gubernatorial race in the country where the Republican candidate leads by outside a margin of error. It's remarkable. And so I did a whole look at the gubernatorial races yesterday, which I had not spent a lot of time on. And I was actually stunned with how well we were doing in the gubernatorial races in the battleground. It's not just the Senate races and the House races. And so all of that data paints a single picture, which is we're going to have a good election. And how good it is will depend, I think, on a couple of things. How hard we work. I mean, to use the trippy line, right? About, we have to do the work. And Democrats have shown that they're willing to do the work and work very hard. And the second thing will be whether things continue to get worse for the country, and that Trump continues to make things worse. And the evidence is that he seems to be unafraid to make things worse.
Well, look at the tariffs with Canada. Yeah. I mean, it's like he's trying to lose elections in Maine and Alaska and Michigan.
Yeah, and I think that the inflation data today was again bad. The GDP data, the economy is slowing down. We had terrible retail sales data. The housing starts data that came out yesterday was god awful. This inflation data continues to be historically terrible, and so the trend line on the economy is actually worsening. It's not getting better. He's doing things to make it even worse. I think one of the stories of the fall is that people start getting their early, they start to have to renew their healthcare plans. And there is a wide belief that both businesses and individuals, because of Trump's taking a baseball bat to our healthcare system, are going to see premium increases, not just in the ACA and Medicaid, but also in private insurance plans, coming right before the election, putting more downward pressure on them. And then even all of his shenanigans around all of his fantasy about the ways that he's going to cheat. I just saw a poll today showing that voters, by a huge margin, 30 or 40 points, hate what he's doing with mail ballots. So while he tries to rig the election, that is also pushing him further and further away from the broader electorate. And so the likelihood is that things are going to be worse for them as we get closer to the election. And also we know from history that it's more likely than not that the party in power loses ground in the final few weeks of the election. So the scenario where things are good now, they are, in my view, likely to get better as we get closer to the election. I don't think they have a way of sort of reversing the kind of the trajectory that we're on. And which then, of course, means that the incentive for him, as desperate as he is, to cheat and to rig and to deny a peaceful transfer of power grows. And so we have to both win this conventional, as Mark Elias says, the most important thing we can do to prevent Trump from cheating is by winning this election by such a big margin that it will be impossible for him to cheat. But we also, I am now involved in the party-wide work to sort of anticipate, if I can use this word, the fuckery to come in October, November, and beyond. And I think we're much more prepared for this than we have been historically. I mean, I think it's not, I think, where we need it to be yet. There's still more work to do. But here's one thing that all of your viewers can do if you're worried about the election. Not only help your candidates and do the work that we all do every day, but we all need to vote early, and we need to convince everybody that we know to vote early. And the priority of voting early is voting in person or drop boxes, mail being sort of the third best option. I know there are large parts of the country that vote by mail, but if you have a drop box option, use that instead of using the mail, given the disruption that has happened or may happen. And also what early voting does is it does two really important things. It helps create a bigger turnout for us, because when you vote early, you're allowing the campaign to move to lower propensity GOTV targets earlier, which actually creates a bigger turnout and makes it more likely we win. But it also makes it harder for them to cheat, because what's going to happen is if the country sees weeks and weeks of very high early vote turnout and the election working as everyone thinks it should, and seeing democracy do its job every day all across the country, it gets much harder for them to claim that somehow this had all been rigged, when people were seeing with their own eyes that it was actually working as it was supposed to for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so one of the most powerful tools that we have to both win the election and to prevent any cheating is by voting early, and by getting everyone you've ever met to vote early with you, to create your own campaign, early vote campaign. We are going to be working with the 50 state parties for them to be generating and launching early vote campaigns, in the states across the country. We need to turn early voting into sort of a national celebration, a celebration of our democracy, as a way of giving the big, double middle finger Trump and his liberalism. And so we have an opportunity not just to sort of fret, but we have tools that are available to us, that are available to each one of us, to be able to make it more likely we win and less likely that they can cheat effectively in November.
Simon, I appreciate you taking so much time to be with us today. You always are such a wealth of information and also hope, which we desperately need in these times. Thank you so much for stopping by, and please subscribe to Simon's Substack. Every day he is just a font of information, and it's a great way to start your day.
Susan, thank you. And again, congratulations on the remarkable success, particularly since you came on board, by the way, of Lincoln Square. It's, you guys are punching hard every day, doing your part. And it's just really, and I love hanging out with all of you. And so thanks for what you guys do every day. And subscribe. If you're a Hopium person, please subscribe to Lincoln Square. They're doing remarkable stuff every day.
Thank you so much, Simon. And thanks to all of you for joining us as well.